Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox back for another episode. And we go in a very different direction today because I have Dr. Loic Wright with me. We met last week, or maybe 2 weeks ago, when I was in Dublin and he led tours on James Joyce and Joyce's work, Ulysses. And I asked him if he would come on the pod to talk about his love for Joyce, his academic study in this area, and all things James Joyce and Ulysses. Dr. Wright, first of all, welcome and thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me today.
Thanks, Tom. Lovely to be here. Lovely to meet you last week as well.
So I'm a son of a professor, so anyone that's got a PhD, I have to call doctor. So you will get the full Monty here
Oh,
in
you're
this
very good.
podcast. Could you tell us, though, about your academic background, your study, and really where did this love of all things Joyce come from?
Yes, I'm from Dublin in Ireland. I grew up here and I studied in University College Dublin, UCD, which is where Joyce attended. And I spent a lot of my undergrad years kind of intentionally moving away from Joyce because his face was on the library. His name was attached to bursaries. He was in statues. There was James Joyce Gin, James Joyce Pub Award. So I was always a bit skeptical about it. And then there was a protest in Dublin City one day, and I couldn't go home because my bus was delayed. So I had €3 in my pocket, and so I found Joyce's Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man for 2.99. So I picked it up and I just started reading it on the spot, and I was able to recognize street names, recognize Dublin, even though it was 100 years apart. And all of a sudden, I got very into it, and I ended up doing a master's focused on Joyce, and then I ended up working at James Joyce Museum for about 8 years, where I still do some kind of freelance tours. And I did my PhD. I finished my PhD last year on Irish writers just after Joyce. So I've always had a very close connection to both his life in some ways and his work through my research.
So I had my view of Joyce was through the prism of modernist literature. And what I really got from you and your tour was a couple of different things. One was how much he was grounded in, as you said, Dublin City, literally to street names and even to addresses, number one. But number two, the other thing you touched on is how he spoke to us in the 21st century. Literally, the problems or the stories, I would say, he told really speak to us today. And many of the same issues he talked about we're still dealing with today. So I wanted to use that as an introduction. Why do you think Joyce is still important in 2024?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. You're right to mention that thing I'd mentioned on the tour, which is this idea that he said to Cyril Connolly, who was the editor of Horizon magazine, I'm much more interested in Dublin street names than I am about the riddles of the universe. And so there is part of the reason Joyce is so revered across the world is because he can bring universality in very specific locality. And he used to defend or at least justify a lot of his works to his brother Stanislaus. And he had mentioned his manifesto in some ways to transform the daily bread of everyday existence into something with a permanent artistic life of its own. That's a quote from Joyce. And this idea that he was very much interested in daily characters, everyday life, and that he felt that certainly you had much more in common with someone in another country who was just living day to day, this idea of the daily bread of existence, than you did in terms of categories or labels that were applied to people that Joyce often felt were applied very arbitrarily and did nothing more than to divide people. So I think this is what he tries to get through with a lot of his work is just the daily existence of people and show this empathy between individuals that is often devoid of any religious or national kind of categorization. That's the most important thing. This is why so many people gravitate towards Dublin when they come on their Joycean pilgrimages. They've never seen O'Connell Street or Sackville Street as it was known in Joyce's time. They've never seen Little Britain Street, but they know about these characters who perhaps they resonate with for some reason, even though they have very little shared national experience.
You also talked about the Dublin of 1904, 1914, 1924, when Joyce was writing in your tour. Could you describe for us what Dublin's role as the second largest city in the British Empire was? And then the other thing you drove home was the disparity in wealth from just some of the worst poverty you can imagine to some gloriously large estates within the city.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, bear in mind, he's born in 1882 and Ireland doesn't get independence or partial independence until 1922. Most of his writing career, and certainly the writing career that we come to know, Dubliners, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and Ulysses, are written just on the cusp of Ireland being partitioned and gaining partial independence. And so Dublin at this point occupies a very bizarre situation in many ways. You're right to mention that it had formerly been seen as the second city of the British Empire. It was the place of a lot of wealth in the 1700s, and it was only after the passing of the Acts of Union and the Irish Parliament was dissolved that all of a sudden it's this kind of troublesome outpost. So you have the 1803 rebellion, 1798 rebellion, 1848, the lead up to the early 1900s with the Irish literary revival. So all of a sudden it's this, as I said, troublesome outpost of the British Empire right on its doorstep as well. And Joyce is growing up in this Dublin. He's born in 1882. A couple of months after he's born, in May, there's the Phoenix Park murders, which is where a group of Irish Republicans called the Invincibles assassinate the Viceroy in the Phoenix Park on the day he arrives to take a seat as the Viceroy in Dublin. So there's a lot of agitation. And also in the lead up then to the 1900s, you get the Irish Revival and this idea of renegotiating Irish national culture through literature and art, etc. So it's a very interesting time to come up. And bear in mind, the slums in Dublin at this point are alleged to be worse than Calcutta. So there is tremendous poverty that is endemic throughout the city. And on the other side, you also get the ascendancy class. That is to say, those who came from Anglo-Irish backgrounds who had been given large country estates from dispossessed Catholic farmers. And this is where a lot of the authors from the Irish literary revival came from as well. So there is also a skepticism on the part of Joyce, but other authors, in this idea that these very wealthy landowning classes are the ones pioneering the Irish literary revival, saying this is true Irish identity, this rural peasantry, and it's not one that they identified with or ever had to come to grips with in terms of daily survival. So there is this very bizarre balance between a high-minded rhetoric and the reality of living in Dublin at the time that Joyce is casting a very skeptical eye over for the most part.
See, first book I believe Joyce published was The Dubliners. And once again, I had completely misunderstood that. I thought he sat down and wrote literally back to back to back. And that's not quite the way it worked. Could you maybe take us through that book, why that book put him on the map? And in many ways, I got from you was one of his most important books.
Absolutely. So yeah, he's invited to write short stories that have to be simple and rural for a magazine called The Irish Homestead. Is run by a man called George Russell, or AE. And he's one of these very high-minded Irish literary revival pioneers. And so the only issue with this concept of writing these short stories for the Irish Homestead is the Irish Homestead has ads for agricultural equipment in it. And it is known by some Dubliners as the pig's paper. So as a result of this agricultural leaning. So Joyce, as a young man, is quite skeptical about this. He doesn't want his name attached to it. So when he publishes his first short story, The Sisters, in August of 1903, he does so under the name Stephen Daedalus, which is a name that he will go on to recycle throughout his career as his alter ego, which he uses in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. But as he goes on anyway, he continues writing these short stories, and he's paid per short story. He spends longer writing trying to get the short story collection published than he actually spends writing them. There is quite a significant difficulty getting Dubliners published for a number of reasons. He has two kind of tentative contracts. One of them is with George Roberts, who runs Bansal & Co. publishers in Dublin, and the other is Grant Richards in London. And there are some issues outstanding. For example, the word bloody is still deemed obscene, and even just the mention of this can get a publisher to lose their license if they're embroiled in an obscenity trial. Joyce also makes reference to the British King in one of the short stories, Ivy Day in the Committee Room. So there is quite a lot of difficulty in terms of getting this published. No one really wants to take a risk on this little known author who is quite daring. Joyce is kind of aware of this daring as well. He says he wants to show the Irish people themselves in his neatly polished looking glass. He has this image of Dubliners, the collection, as being really important for Dubliners and Irish people more generally to see the paralysis that they're stuck in Dublin, certainly in late stage colonial Dublin for the most part. He wants to basically give a moral history of the chapter of his country. And he chooses Dublin for the scene because that city seems to him the center of paralysis. So many characters in the collection are metaphorically paralyzed sometimes. They want to better their circumstances, but they don't quite have the gumption, the kind of innovation, or at least the courage. Sometimes they're physically paralyzed, like the character of Evelyn in the short story Evelyn, who wants to go to Argentina with her boyfriend Frank, but just can't take her hands off the railing. She's physically paralyzed. She's just unwilling to take that step. And this is what Joyce saw as being endemic in Dublin, and certainly a Dublin that was the servant of two masters, as he would say in Ulysses, one British and one Italian. This idea of Ireland in the 1900s being kind of stuck at the whim of British colonial imperialism and also the Holy Roman Catholic Church. And these, in Joyce's eyes, in many ways, were two very stifling influences that he was trying to at least show Irish people that they could escape the clutches of.
What was the reception to the Dubliners?
Dubliners is an interesting one because it does put him on the map in some ways in terms of a broader international literary cohort. He befriends the likes of T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Wyndham Lewis, etc. He will go on to make connections such as Harriet Weaver Shaw, who will bankroll a lot of his work. And then it really puts him on a much more international footing when he will go on then to meet the likes of Sylvia Beach, etc., who is the only person bold enough to publish Ulysses when nobody else will. And it's just been embroiled up in an obscenity charge as well. So Dubliners is crucial for putting him on the map. And a year later, he starts publishing or serializing A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, which is his semi-autobiographical coming-of-age story set in Dublin and which very much follows his own life. And it's then published a year later in 1916 by B.W. Hooch. So there is this very quick turnaround when you consider it takes him 7 years to get it published, Dubliners that is, and then all of a sudden he is serializing Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. He has a play that he writes called Exiles, 1918. He has 2 sets of poetry collections, and then Ulysses is being written and also serialized from 1918 onwards as well. So it's a very quick turnaround when he goes from having fought so diligently and ardently to get Dubliners published at all.
How do you assess a portrait of an artist as a young man here in 2024?
It's a very interesting question because Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is one of those texts that has a lot of afterlives. So Huey Newton, one of the founders of the Black Panthers, had said in an interview that his political awakening came from reading Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. This idea of the whole story of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man essentially is Stephen Dedalus, who is, as I mentioned, Joyce's alter ego. He grows up in Dublin, 1882. He goes to the same schools that Joyce did. And this idea of the coming of age, the Bildungsroman story, is constantly fragmented. And this idea that how can you find your own identity in a society that has not found its identity? And he's talking, of course, of colonial Ireland. This idea of how can you find your place as an Irishman when Ireland has not found its place among the nations of the earth, as Robert Emmet, the Irish revolutionary, would say. And so Portrait has these afterlives. Huey Newton has this same sense of trying to find one's identity when the identity you're supposed to belong to is not fully allowed to flourish. And in 1964, the Spanish translation of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man would go on to be really important for Cuban revolutionaries as well, who were trying to continue the spirit of the revolution from the 1950s. So Portrait of the Artist has this very long-standing legacy, even if it's not always the most cited of Joyce's work. It's often shadowed by Ulysses, but it seems to be the one that has quite a significant draw for people. I mean, even if you look at popular culture, Rage Against the Machine, that American kind of political rap metal band from the 90s, had Portrait of the Artist on their album covers as well. So there was always this connection between kind of insurgency, or at least trying to flourish under the thumb, that Portrait of the Artist seems to have ignited in a lot of people.
And then let's turn now to Ulysses. How would you help us assess Ulysses? Is it all of the things we've discussed and more, or is it uncategorizable today?
Ulysses is interesting. I mean, it is a mix in many ways of Dubliners and Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Portrait is something of a playground for Joyce's ideas that he will pushed to the limit, perhaps, in Ulysses. And so at its most simple, for anyone who's unfamiliar, it's set on the 16th of June, 1904. It's the day that Joyce had his first date with his wife, Nora Barnacle, in Dublin. And basically based off of the Odyssey, Homer's Odyssey, the story of Odysseus coming back from the Trojan War. And it's about a man called Leopold Bloom. And Leopold Bloom is a half Jewish ad canvasser who lives in Dublin. And his wife, Molly, is having an affair. And he wants to just let them get on with the affair. He's not particularly interested in pursuing any justice over it for the most part. So he spends the day walking around Dublin. He will get out of the house to let them get on with their affair. He will go and buy some lemon soap. He's going to go do some work. He's looking for an ad from the Kilkenny People with a set of crossed keys. He's an ad canvasser. He is going to go get his lunch in Davy Burns, and he walks around the city and he thinks about his deceased son, Rudy, who died quite young. And he walks around the city. And on the other hand, same time we get Stephen Dedalus. So it's a continuation from A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Stephen has just had an altercation with his friend Buck Mulligan in the Martello Tower in Sandy Cove, which is about 8 miles south of Dublin City. And he walks around and he doesn't particularly like his father, so he feels that he can't go home to his father's house either. And so it's very much this story of a sonless father and a fatherless son. It's Odysseus and Telemachus. And they narrowly meet a number of times, and then they finally do meet towards the end of the novel. And there is this kind of pseudo reconciliation between the two, at least. And then the final chapter is Molly Bloom's chapter. So Leopold's wife, and we get those uninterrupted sentences of her thought process, about 60 pages with 8 full stops. And Joyce, of course, mimicking how we think. We don't stop and start. It just continues. And so Joyce was reconfiguring the Odyssey into 1904 Dublin. So in many ways, you get instead of Odysseus going into Hades, the underworld, Leopold Bloom goes to his friend Paddy Digname's funeral. Or instead of the sirens who are singing siren songs to the men and luring them to their deaths in the sea, to their watery deaths with their lower halves submerged underwater, we get the Sirens Bar on Ormond Quay with Lydia Douce and Mina Kennedy pouring pints of stout or porter for the Dubliners, kind of luring them to those deaths. And we get also, instead of the Cyclops, we get the Citizen, who's a very xenophobic, racist man who has an eye patch over one eye. Joyce was trying to reconfigure, in many ways, one of the most famous stories of homecoming into Dublin society in 1904, which was not always sure of its own identity and these ideas of foundational myths. And of course, Joyce, as I mentioned, was very interested in looking at the everyday, but he also did say allegedly that he had filled Ulysses with so many puzzles and enigmas to keep the scholars arguing for hundreds of years to come. And this is perhaps why people do find it as challenging as they do to read for the most part.
I believe his next major work was Finnegan's Wake. What can you tell us about that book?
So Ulysses is difficult. Finnegan's Wake is impossible. For starters, Finnegan's Wake is a circle or a cycle. It's the last sentence feeds into the first sentence of the novel, so you can never fully finish it. You'll just keep going in circles. It's worth noting that Joyce, in many ways, feels perhaps that he's exhausted the possibilities of the English language while he's writing Finnegan's Wake, so he kind of makes up his own. And he uses a lot of what he calls portmanteau words, which is basically 2 words kind of pushed together. So things like absent-minded, so the idea of being forgetful because you've been drinking absinthe. Also crops, which is a mix between like a corpse and crops, life and death, growth and death, etc. And in many ways, and he also has what he calls thunder words, which is basically, I think it's about 101 letters, one word, and it's designed to mimic the sound of thunder, but it's made up of many different languages, their words for thunder. So you have Welsh, French, Spanish, German, Gaelic, Irish, etc., all crammed into one word to try and mimic the sound of thunder. And part of what he's doing, at least some scholars argue, is that he's trying to reconstruct the Tower of Babel in many ways, trying to cram all the languages back together into one. But he works quite heavily at it for quite a long time. I mean, he published it in 1939. He dies 2 years later in 1941. Over the course of his writing of Finnegan's Wake, he's struggling a lot with increasingly dwindling eyesight. So he names his daughter Lucia after the patron saint of light. And he's having to wear a white surgical gown and stand by the window and let the light bounce off of the gown and back onto the page just to see what he's actually writing. He starts writing Finnegan's Wake with a very large kind of A2 page with nearly red crayon just to see what he's writing. And he's also having to dictate quite a lot of what he wants to write to Samuel Beckett, the famous Irish author who was Joyce's secretary for a time. Towards this point, it is kind of seen as this behemoth undertaking that very few people are able to decipher. Joyce apparently said he wanted his next book after Finnegan's Wake to be quite simple and short, but obviously he dies before he can accomplish that. So Finnegan's Wake is very much the zenith in some ways, the kind of climactic point in Joyce's experimentalism for the most part.
You mentioned sort of your journey to Joyce and all of the images and names of Joyce around the city of Dublin. That's not how he was viewed by his home country at the time of his death. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, Joyce left Dublin in 1902 to study medicine in Paris, and then he came back home because his mother was sick. Then he left again in October 1904, and he only returned a handful of times. So he returns in 1909 to open the Volta Cinema, which is Dublin's first cinema. And he does feel quite disillusioned with Dublin in particular, this idea of paralytic capital city. But he writes about it. That's how we know him. He writes all about Dublin. And when he dies in 1941, his wife, Nora Barnacle, tries to get his remains repatriated. The Irish government says no further action required. So there's no real appetite to bring him back or to honor this author who has put Dublin on the map. I mean, Ireland has always had great writers, but none had the same local kind of color and eccentricities that Joyce included and became as famous. So there was an embittered attitude, I think, in many ways. And it was only American scholars in the 1950s, like Richard Ellman, Hugh Kenner, who really kind of shone a light on Joyce and Joyce studies. I mean, it was very unfashionable to read Joyce in Ireland at the time because he had such a kind of obscene reputation. Even his own aunt, Josephine, refused to read Ulysses. And he said, if Ulysses is not fit to read, then life isn't fit to live, because I haven't included anything in there that isn't done on a daily basis by just humans. So there's certainly a divide between Joyce and his reputation and Joyce in Ireland. And recently enough, the Irish government had tried to make some movements to repatriating Joyce's remains from Flunturn Cemetery in Zurich. And it was, I don't mind saying this, some people might disagree, but it was kind of seen as just a tourism cash grab for the most part. I mean, Ireland has been a country that never had any interest in promoting Joyce. And then all of a sudden, when the possibility of turning it into a tourist shrine came up, it was kind of jumped at. So he's still in Flunturn Cemetery in Zurich, and doesn't seem like there's any real plans to repatriate him. But for the most part, the Joyce industry kind of took off. As I mentioned, there are many name brands now that are specifically Joyce themed, like the Pub Award, the gin, etc. So it's become quite fashionable all of a sudden.
So maybe leave you with the following question. You are a professor of Joyce studies, and you talked about that. You talked about that as part of your tour. You talked about that on this podcast. For the high school or university student, what would you tell them about why you should study Joyce, whether it's in Dublin City or where I live in West Texas?
I think Portrait of the Artist is in many ways a great entry point for anyone who's interested. I mean, like the Bildungsroman, that is to say, the coming of age story, is one of the oldest formats available to anybody. And they're always the most popular because you do get to see the world through the characters' eyes as they grow up. And I mean, Portrait of the Artist really begins with Stephen as a baby. The opening line is, "Once upon a time, and a very good time it was, there was a moo cow coming down along the road." I mean, this is fairy tale stuff. This is as childish as it comes. And then you get to grow with the character of Stephen from that childhood up until his entry into university and his graduation from university. So it does really give you a sense. There are some very comparable experiences that many people might have reading Portrait of the Artist as a young man, but you also get a sense of how an individual, certainly a young individual, will find themselves at odds with the society that they're growing up in and what they want from them. Dubliners is very interesting as well. You get these flashes or these sketches of everyday life that are designed around what Joyce called epiphanies, these moments of realization that these characters have that they're just not where they wanted to be, which is, of course, reflective of the Irish people who were not granted self-determination and were not where they wanted to be. So I think for many people who would be skeptical or unsure, I'd say Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man or Dubliners would be good entry points before you graduate onto Ulysses for the most part.
Dr. Wright, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. But before we leave, I wanted to ask you if our listeners wanted to follow up with you, maybe speak with you further or get more information, what might be the best place for them to go or the best way to do so?
You could always find me on Twitter. I always reply to anything on Twitter. It's Duffels1, and I'm on there and I talk a little bit about my research, etc. for the most part. And I'm always looking to have kind of discussions with people about this kind of stuff. So I'd be more than welcoming to those who wanted to discuss it.
I wanted to thank you again for taking the time to visit with me, and I hope we can continue this conversation.